This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD via Zoom Judge James Murphy-Aguilú. He is the Circuit Cook County Circuit Court Judge. How are you today, Judge Aguilú?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We always want to help our listeners when election day comes around. They have this ballot with about 100 names of judges, and it is such an important part of the ballot. But they always tell me, because I work as an election judge, they say, I'm not going to vote that because I don't know who those people are. So if our listeners want to know who you are, what would you tell them?
Yeah, so the first thing you could do is go to my website. It's JMA4Judge, FOR judge.com. That's one area that you can learn about me. There's also a handful of publications that are put out every year that do a great job. The Bar Associations, Chicago Bar Association, Illinois State Bar Association do report cards on the different judicial candidates, and Justice Watch does one as well. I think that all of those, they have the relevant information that you need to, understand what a person's background is. As a judicial candidate, we can't talk about politics because we're supposed to be somewhat devoid from it, which makes it kind of odd that we're in the middle of an election, right? And we're not allowed to talk about politics or our positions on things. But at the end of the day, what you're voting for is somebody who's qualified, somebody who represents your community. I think you're able to learn about, people's backgrounds through those spaces, CBA, ISBA, like I said.
So are you allowed to interview with me and talk about politics, or are you even not supposed to do that?
Well, it depends. I can absolutely interview with you, and I really thank you for giving me the platform. We can talk about, I certainly talk about my background, my history, my qualifications, sort of my philosophy, judicial philosophy. But I'm not allowed to, for instance, take positions on current elections or say like, I'm supporting this candidate or that candidate. Other than currently running judges, the judicial canons don't allow us to, endorse anybody other than other running judges that are running in this particular election. So
you are allowed to endorse other judges that are running in this election?
yes, that's the only caveat, and that's because we all are running on a slate together. And so as a result of it, when they changed the rules about what judges could do and couldn't do, they did allow for that one exception, which is that you can endorse other candidates for judge that are running in the same year you're running. So for instance, Justice Joy Cunningham, who's running for Supreme Court, is running currently. She appointed me. She recognized the work that I had done for the community and interviewed me, and as a result of it, ultimately offered me an opportunity to become a judge in a vacant seat. So she would be somebody who I would be endorsing.
In other words, are you only allowed to endorse a fellow slate candidates, or if there were another judge that is not on your slate, are you allowed to endorse that judge?
Yes. So if you're a candidate for judge in this cycle, because I'm running, I could endorse anybody. I don't have to endorse my slate mates. But
I see.
I think if you I started out telling people, go to the CBA, go to the ISBA. I think when you go to the different publications and you read about the experiences, backgrounds of the slated judges, you're going to recognize how incredibly strong those individuals are compared to a lot of my colleagues do not have candidates in their races. But when you compare the candidates that are running against my colleagues that do have candidates in their races, you'll find that there's no comparison in terms of their experience, their history, and their qualifications.
In the past, the Latino caucus has argued that the judges were not appointing enough Latino candidates, Latino judges. but they appointed you, and they also invited you to be on their slate. What makes you different from the previous Latino judges that wanted to be slated and wanted to be appointed?
Well, part of that is I wish I could answer that question, but I just don't know because I'm not in the room when those individuals are when those conversations are happening. I know, um, that there have been that's been a conversation, I've been a part of or been working with the Illinois Latino Judges Association for a couple of years prior to leading up to this. Last year we had three slated Latinas, all that became judges, and Judge Ruth Godino, Judge Araceli de la Cruz, and Judge Diana Lopez. They were all slated. They all won their race, and they all became judges. Judge Araceli de la Cruz was appointed also. So, and then I was appointed. I think, when you look at the population of Illinois and you look at the population of Cook County, we're still somewhat underrepresented when it comes to the judiciary. And I think that that's the conversation that is being had. There's a desire for the Supreme Court to take the same approach of diversity towards the appointment process as they're asking the general legal community to be taking. And I think they are doing that. Obviously, I am just one of qualified judges, but there have been a tremendous amount of qualified Latinos who are on their way up and will become judges someday, and that have become judges. And unfortunately, we still need to continue to work towards that and identify those candidates and bring them forward. I was lucky enough to have been in that grouping of people that got identified. So
When you were, and you still are in the Latino Judges Association, what about the years before, in 2022, I guess, or earlier? Oh, 2023 was the last election, right? And then
I
what
think
about the,
2022.
yeah, 2022? And then what about the previous election compared to the 2022? How many Latino judges were on the ballot at that time? Or slated at that time versus the 2022 election.
I don't know exactly. I know Araceli de la Cruz was slated at that time also by the party, as she had not been appointed. She lost that election by a very, very small margin, and she was ultimately appointed after that because she was the. I had worked with her in the state's attorney's office, and she had an excellent reputation. I knew her as an excellent attorney. So and she's an excellent judge. So we were very lucky that happened. I don't remember exactly how many were slated in that election prior to that, but over the years there have always been there's a Latino caucus, and the Latino caucus generally does their homework ahead of time to try to identify candidates, and they go to bat, I suppose, for them. I don't know how that process works. That's something you have to talk to the committeemen about, the Democratic Party, about how they divvy up the spots. But I do know that, for instance, Alderman Mike Rodriguez has become very involved in that particular part of that process, and he was a big supporter of mine. He was somebody that I met with a couple of years ago, so that he knew who I was, could get an idea of who I was as a human being, as a father. We have similar age kids, as a lawyer, my dedication to public service, and then after he got that sense, then he became a huge supporter of mine. So, I think part of it is also helping, as Latinos, we need to help the next generation of people coming up and educate them about who they need to present themselves before, who what types of work they need to do, how they can get through there's a whole process, right? You got to go through the bar associations, you have to do that whole the application, all of that, and just making sure that we're helping the next group of people come up through there. That's one of our responsibilities, and I think that's what Illinois Latino judges have started to do. And I think you're going to see that the result will be in future elections. You're going to see more and more Latino candidates that are identified as, people that should be given consideration.
Oh, how did you get on the slate? Did you apply to get on the slate? Do you know if someone helped you to get on the slate? How did you get on the Democratic slate?
So several years ago, I'd gone through the process. All you have to do is send a letter of intent to be seen, and then you get on, and then you're allowed to present your credentials before the slate. That's the process. So there's kind of an open call. Anyone who is interested in presenting before the Democratic Party, send a letter of intent to be at slating, and then your name gets on the list, and then you provide them with, resumes and backgrounds. Of course, they want, in the judicial races, they also want to see your ratings by the bar associations. And so once you get in that, once you start presenting before them, send that letter, then the bar associations also typically begin calling you. So the process kind of all happens in tandem. But that's all I did was I sent a letter and said I'd like to present before the slate, and then that's what I did. I went and presented. So this is the third time that I've been in front of them. The first time I was actually slated in the number of openings there were. Like the last election cycle, I was an alternate. So, they at that time they were saying, we like you, but there are other people in front of you who we like more. And so I came back the next year, and then I made it.
Mhm. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us at WZRD via Zoom Circuit Court, Cook County Circuit Court Judge James Murphy-Aguilú. Judge Aguilú, when you were slated, did you were you did you you appeared before them and answered questions? What about the IVI-IPO? Did you go before them to be slated as well for an endorsement?
So there's been a handful of different organizations, IVI, IPO, who have had events, or who have had open calls for slating. A lot of them will give like questionnaires that you have to answer.
Mhm.
I have done a handful of them, been endorsed by a number of people. So I did that with a lot of the labor organizations, was endorsed by the CFL, did the same thing with Personal PAC. So I was endorsed by Personal PAC. IVI IPO, I did not go before. And for no particular reason other than I think timing didn't work out for me in that particular case. It's been really, I've been a working lawyer my whole life, so a campaign is a total departure from what I've ever done before, and I didn't realize how much time really is involved in these. But no, IVIPO is one of many organizations that do these vetting and do endorsements. And if you go to my website, you can see I was endorsed by a handful of labor organizations, a handful of community organizations, AmVote, which would just recently endorse me, Personal PAC, like I said, CFL, Local 2 Firemen, and so I've had a handful of different organizations that have endorsed me. So
For our listeners who don't know what the IVI-IPO stands for, it is the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organizations. Judge Aguilo, when you went before the unions to get their endorsement, what did they ask you?
I mean, typically these are all what they want to know about your background. In my particular case, I had worked in some organizations that had worked with organized labor. So I worked for the city of Chicago for a period of time, and they have, I pretty much almost all the unions are represented within there, but ASME was the major union that I was working with. And at the time I was a supervisor. So I was working with unionized individuals as a supervisor. So, like They ask about your connection with labor. When have you worked with, and what are your feelings on labor, generally speaking. But then more often than not, what they're really asking is qualifications. They're looking to endorse people who are qualified candidates have done the work as lawyers. That's in almost every one of these interviews I've ever talked about or been involved in. That's what we talk about is somebody's background, is my background, my legal background.
Mhm. But do they care about your past work with the unions as well?
Yeah, I think they want to know that they want to have a good understanding of what your relationship would be to unionized labor. And in this particular case, I had supervised people that had been involved in labor organizations. I started out as a state's attorney, and I don't think the state's attorney's office even still is unionized. The public defender's office was, but
Mhm.
our office was not. So it was something that I would have loved to have been a part of. It just wasn't an option for me at that time. My first involvement with a unionized workforce was when I was a supervisor. Um,
Oh, so
and
what you mean is that when you were a supervisor, you were supervising people that were in the union.
correct. And this particular one was asked me, and I worked for the city of Chicago. And so they asked me about what my experience was with that.
What was your
Um,
experience with that?
I mean, I think the people that I worked with were incredible people. And much like when I was a state's attorney and there were conversations about, unionizing, it's not, the intent is just to make sure that you're protecting people's rights, um, that you're giving them opportunities for fair process with respect to discipline or, and so I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of always, I'm a judge. So the law gives us that baseline. This is what we're going to follow. This is what the law says. So anytime the union's involvement allows a much more structured set of rules, and there's the contract, we follow the contract, right? And so
Mhm.
that's kind of that's how I always saw it. I saw it as the better I understand what the rules are and you understand the rules, then we can, you know, it evens the playing field in terms of how our conversations go. So that was my response, more or less.
So did you have to preside over maybe disputes that maybe some employees had, and then they would bring the union rep along to speak with you or some other department or supervisor? Did you have to deal with that? And how did that
So
help you? If it did, how did that help you in what you are doing now?
yeah, so yes and no. So in some senses, yes, in some senses, no. So I'll kind of answer that by saying this.
Okay.
Um, so I worked at Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and so we were working directly with Fraternal Order of Police, in terms of doing investigations of police officers, and so we were working with the union in a certain sense, right? They were the people who we were investigating were represented by the union, but I our portion of that was the investigative portion, and then it moved over to the department. So after we would make a recommendation in terms of our findings, then it became the department working with the union in terms of the stuff you're talking about. Like, what was the discipline going to be? How are they going to implement that? The grievance process, all that. So I did not deal with that portion of it. I only dealt with them in the interview process with the union.
Mhm.
And then when I dealt with my employees, in theory, yes, if there had been issues, we would have dealt with their union reps. But we didn't really have that. Typically speaking, there were, of course, if you were going to have any sort of disciplinary conversation with an employee, one of the rules was they had to have a union rep in the room. And so, again, that goes back to this idea of it's nice to know that there are rules because you can always apply the rules. There would be no reason why we would want to have a disciplinary conversation without the union rep in the room. They're a witness, they're there to represent the person. These are emotional situations. So you have somebody who's a little bit more, who's there as a representative capacity. How does that help me as a judge? Again, there are rules, right? Like as a judge, our job is to try to maintain consistency so that one person comes to court and they get the same treatment that somebody else comes to court. And so that's why I appreciate that. I appreciate this, the black and white, where it's like, this is what we're supposed to do. We're going to do this every single time. And then if we have thought the process out well, and if we've, then it should result in a more equitable experience for everybody. So that's really why, that's in a lot of ways, that's why I believe in the idea of the unions, because they help negotiate and bargain. And I was not a part of any of those, but they help negotiate and bargain a set of rules, a contract that the employer is then required to follow. And also, these are the expectations of the employee. So we don't have to go back and forth about what that is, that we kind of know what that process is. And that's very similar to what you're doing on the bench.
Mhm. Well, I've heard from many people that when they try to contact their union rep for help, like they email again and again, or they call again and again, and they're not able to reach them. I wonder if they really needed the union rep to represent them in a disciplinary action. Would all of them be able to find their union rep? Some of them just can't find them. There's no response to the communication. Have you heard about that? Did any situation arise where, since they did not have a union rep, then you had to find another way to deal with a hearing?
So I haven't necessarily had that issue. The times that we were dealing with people that required union representation, um, they always had the person. And like for instance, at the city, those reps worked with us. They were, their colleagues.
Mhm.
So and it was a much smaller organization. In other organizations I've been in, where they were bigger, there were union reps that were identified in each one of the locations. And like anything else, there are personalities have to get along. You're not always going to as with lawyers, you can go out and you can hire your own attorney, right? And one attorney may be just as qualified as another attorney, but you may not get along with them. And a lot of the relationship between attorney and client, like anything, is trust. So if you're forced to use this particular union rep or that particular union rep, you may not have that developed between that person. So I can understand why it's an imperfect system, meaning that not everyone's going to always have the same experience. But the idea of having a consistent process, the concept is that we can have as close to a consistent experience as possible. Doesn't mean everyone's going to have that.
Mhm.
So I have not been in a situation in which people told me they were having a difficult time contacting their union rep or getting their union rep there. I've seen it in situations where people felt like their union rep didn't do what they were expecting of them. There were times they felt that way. There was other times when they were wanted their union rep to do more, but their union rep wasn't necessarily allowed to do more because of the specifics of the rules. So, I think you're just going to get a varied experience, just like you do in the justice system. But in hopes, if we apply those rules consistently, we'll get a more consistent outcome.
You are working right now in traffic court. Is that your main focus, or uh, sometimes if the other parts of the court need you, then you could be working in other cases as well?
So we're judges of general jurisdiction, which means that we could be assigned to any of the different cases. In a lot of the counties in Illinois, there's 102 counties in Illinois. Uh, Cook makes up 50% of the cases. Of all of Illinois, DuPage makes up 20% of the cases. So 100 counties make up only 30% of the cases, which means that oftentimes those judges may go from traffic to criminal to domestic relations, and that's just not the case in Cook. The reason I'm in traffic is because I was appointed back in July, and that's the first assignment. Every judge goes through starts out in traffic. I happen to have background, like I was telling you, I started my career as a state's attorney. I did 2 years of criminal appeals. I did 3 years of felony trial in the Narcotics Bureau. And then I did, before I left the office, I spent time in civil actions where I did 1983 or defense of, defended the county against lawsuits from typically, most often, they were claims out of the jail. So prisoner litigation, whether it was, denial of medical care or excessive force. And so, I spent time doing all these different varied things, but I do have some background in criminal. And so that's been very helpful as I've been in traffic, because um, the traffic process is essentially a criminal process, right? They're misdemeanor traffic cases, but they move in the way that criminal works. So that's been really helpful to me that I had that background. But I could get assigned anywhere. At this point, I don't know where I'll end up.
You mentioned that you worked before as a assistant state's attorney in litigating cases that were brought against the Cook County. As a judge right now, I know that you're in general jurisdiction. Did any case come before you similar to that about some detainee or prisoner being bringing suit against the Cook County for lack of for abuse in the prison system?
Well, so it wouldn't be before me at this point. And also, those cases are litigated in federal court. So um, I don't think I had any state court cases when I worked for the state's attorney's office. All of those were moved to federal court. Section 1983 is um, a federal law. And so to sue Cook County, you have to sue in federal court. So ultimately, we were dealing with that in federal courts. I wouldn't handle any of those cases. Uh, not only would I not handle them, but I don't not even in the division to handle anything like that. That was a totally different. That was a different time. It was a great opportunity for me to work in federal court and see the differences between the federal court and the state court, which is part of where I think, I would argue that my diversity is not only the fact that I'm Latino, right, but as you've mentioned, but that I'm also worked in both state and federal court. I was able to see how those judges worked, see how the settlement process worked over there. I got to work with, because it was this prisoner litigation, oftentimes we had either a non, like an unrepresented individual, so they were representing themselves, or they would be assigned a lawyer on a pro bono basis by the federal court. Though those lawyers that were being assigned were some of the biggest law firms in the city. They were not normally doing this particular type of litigation, but they were doing it on a pro bono basis. So that was also, something kind of new, was to be working with, law firms like Winston Strom or Sun and Shine, or, some of these larger law firms, some of these big partners in these law firms. So again, that's all part of the diversity of my practice, was that I got those opportunities.
How was it that these big law firms were working pro bono to help these people?
Well, so I don't know whether it's something mandated, but the federal court would assign them. So when you'd have prisoners who would bring litigation, the federal court would essentially mandate that they, or assign them to a prisoner, and then that's how they would get it.
What about if it's not in Cook County Jail, then what about in like a police station or some kind of holding facility if a prisoner or detainee wanted to bring a lawsuit against the police, or where would that kind of suit go? Would that also end up in federal court?
Sometimes, so they can be state crimes or federal crimes. Oftentimes, if we're talking about these 1983 cases, like excessive force, the types of litigation that we were doing even at COPA. And I mean, we weren't doing litigation, but we were doing investigations of incidents, right? This was from an administrative basis. It would have been for the punishment of the police officer. But ultimately, these cases oftentimes were also being litigated in federal court, sometimes at the same time, sometimes maybe later. So yeah, typically those cases are going to go to federal court. They don't always, they can go to state court. So I think I may have dealt with a few cases that were in state court that were dealing with like warrants or people being held on warrants for too long. But I don't think that they're generally not. They're generally litigated in federal court. I think, but I again, in traffic where I'm at, I wouldn't see any of those issues. Now we could see like in criminal, you may see like a motion to suppress evidence, for instance, based on an unconstitutional stop or something like that. So like that can happen in traffic cases. It will happen. So again, that goes back to, I've spent most of my career litigating these issues on different sides. So at one point I was defending them as a state's attorney. I also spent some time. I had my own law practice. I spent some time doing both criminal defense and plaintiffs 1983 work. So I was on the other side, litigating for a detainee, for instance, in Sangamon County. And in those cases, now we're litigating saying this stop was unconstitutional. So I've been on both sides of that. So that, we do that in traffic occasionally. There will be one of those cases where they say this stop was unconstitutional. There was no basis for the stop, and we have to make those decisions.
Well, so for other judges, they did not have as much experience as you, because I see that at least in for traffic cases, you have the experience of being on both sides. Do you know about your opponents or other people that have applied? What makes you a standout candidate? I know that you said that the bar associations have recommended you highly, but do you know of anything else that helps you stand above the crowd?
I honestly, I think for me, it's diversity, right? So I have a diversity of practice. So I was a state's attorney, yes. But I also was a supervisor at the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. So I investigated police officers. And to be honest with you, I don't think that any of these things define who you are. I am a person who believes in community. I'm raising my kids here in Chicago. I live in Chicago. My kids go to school here. I love this city. I want this city to be safe. I want people to have rights. I want their rights and their humanity to be respected. That's what I bring to the court. My diversity in terms of my practice has given me more insight in understanding what it is to stand with somebody as they're walking into court. When I left the state's attorney's office and opened my practice, it was right around the same time that the state legislature had passed the TVDL law, temporary visitors driver's license. So people who were not naturalized citizens could get driver's licenses. So I had a lot of clients who hired me to help clean up their driving background so that they could get one of these licenses. Now, there was a benefit to the community to have licensed drivers who also then had insurance, right? These were people who couldn't get that before. It wasn't that they didn't want to be in compliance with the law. It was just simply that they didn't have the opportunity. They were scared to go to court. So I got to see what that was like. And knowing that, having come from the state's attorney's office where I looked at everything as this is just a file. What did this person do? I didn't know anything about them as a human being. I only knew what they had done in this one moment of their life. And so that having those two perspectives wasn't that I am excusing their behavior on the day that they did whatever they're accused of doing, but also understanding their humanity, giving people respect in court. I think that is all part of, that was how I was raised. My mom's from Puerto Rico, and she came to the United States at 25 years old, for the first time, had never lived in an English speaking country, and she still has an accent to this day. And so I saw how people treated her just because of the way she sounded. My mom was a college professor, and yet I saw that there were people that just, judged her based on how she sounded. And it's understanding that makes me think as people come into my courtroom, not to judge them by what they look like or what they sound like, and to try to really listen to what they're trying to tell me or what they're trying to say. And so that's the humanity that I bring to the court.
In other words, you bring a good customer service to the bench.
I think it's extremely important. Especially in traffic, if somebody is going to have contact with the criminal justice system, it's probably going to be in traffic. This is the majority of people are never going to be in serious criminal court, thankfully, or hopefully somewhere else. But as I've gone on this path, I've learned that everybody in life will at some point encounter the justice system. At some point, you'll be in court, whether it's for a probate matter, a divorce matter, a traffic case. And while it may be, that's my work, I go there every day. But that's that one time that those people go to court. It's extremely important that I consistently remind myself, like, this is the only time they're going to be here. I am maybe the only judge they ever encounter. And so it's my responsibility to carry that for the entirety of it, because I don't know that you'll ever see another one. So I have to treat every person as though this is the only encounter you'll ever have here. And ideally, I can't guarantee people are going to have good experiences, but I do my best to try to make sure they don't have bad experiences.
Is that the way that you think, or is this the way that your training as a judge advised you to think?
Consistently as I talk to my colleagues, I think everybody has a very similar feeling. This is just who I am as a person, though. I think that as a baseline, every judge has to be qualified, meaning they have to have the legal knowledge and experience to say, hey, this, we can understand these issues. But at the secondarily, you want judges who are thoughtful and caring beyond just what is on what the law is. You got to be, I'm a really big believer in procedural justice, meaning let people believe that the process is fair, and then the outcomes are less, people can accept the outcomes a lot better when they believe that the process was fair, right? So it's not a winner and a loser system. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be.
So what would the system be called if it were not a winner and a loser? What would you name that system?
I couldn't even tell you. I don't know what I would ideal. I mean, that would be perfect. I know we don't live in a utopia. Mm-hmm. I know our system isn't perfect, but I do my best to just try to make sure that people leave educated from my room. They know what they need to do next, mm-hmm. At the very least, so make sure they know what they need to do next. Yeah.
When you mentioned that for those people that were applying for TVDL licenses, and you said that you help clean up their background. What did you mean by that?
Well, like, for instance, sometimes they had previous cases like driving on a suspended or driving on a revoked license. So what you would get if you were picked up driving and you didn't have a driver's license, you'd get a charge of driving without a license, and then in theory you could get suspended for that, and then they may have problems with Secretary of State. And so what we did was we would go back in and we would try to help clear up those licenses, those issues that they would have, so that they would be eligible to get a valid driver's license. So
expungement, a kind of an expungement. How do you remove something like that from the record?
Expungements is one way of doing it. There were different things you could sometimes you could go in and you could ask to vacate previous findings, so that instead of it being a conviction, that it was a supervision for something, and maybe they'd have to pay an additional fine, or they'd have to do traffic safety school, or they'd have to do something else. But there were ways of saying, look, there's a greater good by having licensed drivers than putting people in this category where they're never going to get a license because of all the hoops they have to jump through to be able to get that license. And so, the way I saw it was, there are other people that disagree, by the way. I mean, plenty of people that don't agree. They say, oh, no, this was the law, you violated it, done. The way I see it is, like, people are going to drive. They were driving their kids to school. They were driving to work, and they were spending their days looking over their shoulder, trying to make sure that they were never going to get, pulled over or whatever. But occasionally they did. And when they did, the consequences were so extreme that at times they were not going to be able to get their license if we didn't go back in and try to help them clean that up. So one of the things they hired me for was giving them guidance. if we could expunge it, we would expunge it. If we had to go in and motion the case up and ask that the prosecutors look at their criminal history and look at their personal history and possibly vacate a previous conviction, that's what we did. Did it always work? No, it didn't always work. But that was one of the, I think that you'll see that even the state's attorney's office and even these other prosecuting agencies, they tend to, if the legislation is saying, hey, we're moving this direction, so we're moving in a direction where we're going to decriminalize, these, just being from another country or whatever, then they were more willing to work with us on cleaning up the driver's license. So at that time, they were more willing to hear it, as long as, not every person was going to, be eligible for these things. But the people I was working with tended to have like a speeding ticket here or there or something like that, but then they didn't have a license. So then it became an issue in terms of getting that fixed. So
For traffic court, what kind of cases have there been a trend in the environment of traffic court that is different, somehow is different in a way from before, or has everything remained pretty much the same?
yeah, I mean, traffic court, in terms of what we're doing, the misdemeanor traffic cases are pretty similar. There's misdemeanor speedings, there's DUIs, of course, there's driving on suspended licenses. I think there have been changes in terms of what, over the years, the different, and it depends, by the way, county to county, state's attorney's office, the city. They each kind of have their own philosophy on how they prosecute these things or what they prosecute. But that's generally the stuff we're looking at, the misdemeanor traffic stuff, which is the speeding 26 miles and over, the driving on suspended licenses, driving without insurance. And these are, these are important things, because as we drive around, all of us, right, whether you take a bus or an Uber, or you drive yourself, you're putting yourself at risk every time you go out there. And so we want to make sure that we have drivers who are doing everything possible to be either safe drivers by having driver's licenses, having gone through the proper, channels to get those licenses, or even having insurance, because, God forbid an accident happens, you want to make sure that you're covered. And that's really what those insurance charges are for. So that's where we tend to do a lot of the work in traffic court, is there.
You mentioned that the state's attorney's offices and other offices have their own way of doing things. So how do you eventually learn all that? How they're nuanced, and how does that affect how you do your job as a judge?
So we all kind of play our own roles, right? And the state's attorney's office ultimately have decision making over how they charge things, how they move forward, what they charge. So as a judge, our job is not to really get involved in that. We just kind of we give people the opportunity to do what they're going to do, and if they're going to move forward, then they're going to move forward, and if they're going to move forward, they have to have the evidence. So what I try to do, the only thing I really am looking for is that they treat everybody evenly. So I don't like if they're going to do one thing with a person who doesn't have a lawyer and another thing with a person who does have a lawyer. That's going to be something that I'm going to kind of look at and go, I don't know if we're going to do it like that. But how I can do that is not always within my power. But that's ultimately making sure that the system is fair for everybody. That's kind of my role.
And you
In
see
that,
that too, and you do see that in your courtroom, right? People without a lawyer or with a lawyer, and they're being treated differently.
not really. Honestly, no. These offices are very consistent about how they handle cases, and they're very fair. So I haven't seen that. I guess what I'm saying is that because this is outside of my power, the only thing I'm really looking for is to make sure that that's continuing to happen. I have not seen that. It has not been a trend in my courtroom. So
I've heard that judges have to receive training, a certain amount of training every 2 years. Have you been on the bench long enough to have to attend those trainings yet?
Yeah, so every 2 years, it's called EdCon, Education Conference, and
Mhm.
every 2 years, every judge in the state basically has to go and get, it's really no different than every lawyer has to have a certain amount of hours of continued learning every 2 years.
Mhm.
So what they do is they just provide that for all the judges, and basically half of them go, and that was last week. Half the judges went last week, and then half the judges are going in April, I believe. So
Oh,
I'm in the group that's going in April.
oh, okay.
But we also had a new judges training. So all the new judges, since I started, we're all assigned to like a weekly training and small group. And then we also had a training where we went to Springfield for a week and did a training. So I've done a lot of training, at this point since I've been a judge, which is great. It's like one of the reasons I left private practice, to be honest with you, was how difficult it was. There were two major things that I found to be very difficult in private practice, which was one, having to balance the difference between being a lawyer and a business person, because I was trying to do both, wearing both hats, and I didn't like that. I wanted to just be a lawyer and think about those issues only, and not the business side of things. But the
So the
other side of that,
business side is just taking care of your law firm, right? Is that the business side you're talking about?
getting new clients, getting payments, all
Mm.
of those things. Yes,
Uh-huh.
all those things that are just aggravating and frustrating. I just want to be a lawyer.
Mm.
And the other side of it was training, because of course you want to continue to go to training and learn, but training costs money, and training took time. And so as a private attorney, the time uh away from the business and the money that you were taking out, like, yes, there was value in it, but it was hard. It was just much harder to bring myself to want to do it as often, or with that. And now I'm back again. I've worked for in government most of my career, and every place that I've worked at has really emphasized training. When I worked for the city, COPA training was huge. I mean, it was part of the consent decree that we were having to follow, but it was also something that they cared about very much, about making sure that we were consistently and constantly trained and talking about those issues. When I was at the state's attorney's office, every group I was in, we were constantly training, constantly going over the issues. And same thing now as a judge. And that has made me a better lawyer,
Mhm.
I've had that sort of mentorship, and I've had that training through these different places. Yeah, I really put a lot of emphasis in terms of doing those things, which is what has informed me as a human being and a lawyer.
So you had to pay for all these trainings, right? Right now, even as a judge, you will have to pay for that training in April.
Well, no, I mean, it's all part of the package. They want to make sure that the judges are trained. We want to make sure that these judges are given access to great training. And so there's a whole host of, I mean, I don't know. I don't actually like write a check. I mean, we have to get out there and whatnot and pay for meals and all the rest of that, but I don't know. I'm not writing a check to somebody like I was when I had my own firm, right? That was a different story.
Mm.
I mean, in that particular case, I was part of the Chicago Bar Association. I had joined the CBA when I was part of the state's attorney's office. And so I was doing a lot of my training through the CBA. So I was continuing, obviously, I was mandated to continue to do the training. What I'm saying is that because this is a part of the whole fabric of what we do, it makes it a lot easier. They tell me, hey, you're going in April for a week to go get training. And then you go, and then you can just dedicate yourself to getting training. I'm not taking calls from my law firm while I'm in a training. I'm not trying to figure out, all these other various and sundry things. They just say, go get trained, focus on getting trained, focus on being a great lawyer, being a great judge. And that really benefits you in your
What?
profession.
So what do these trainings cover? Do they cover like the new trends, or even let's talk about the COPA training. Is there any similarity between the COPA training and the training you had with the bar associations?
So there's been a really big focus on, um, there's always a focus on ethics, right? So ethics was something that you had to have training on. You also had to have training on diversity and inclusion. And now they're doing a lot of training in the area of, um, bias. And so those were things that were very similar. So like we were doing a lot of those same things at COPA, right? We were doing a lot of those same things at the state's attorney's office, where you had to have a training that had elements of, um, understanding implicit bias. For instance, implicit bias is a big trend, but it has always been something that has been part of conversations. How does implicit bias affect interviews, for instance? How does it affect depositions? How does it affect testimony? And so those things are really important to constantly be thinking about and talking about. And so that's been something that has been a through line across a lot of my trainings, has been those types of trainings.
Are you even trained to ask questions in a certain way so that it does not, so that the question does not contain any implicit bias?
So I don't think there's any way to have anything that doesn't contain implicit bias, but I think that's part of the conversation, right? Is that you're constantly analyzing and pressure testing what you're doing against other people, against other ideologies. Um, I've done trainings, several different trainings on different investigative techniques and what works and what doesn't work, and um, how to, and there's just, in all honesty, these are social sciences. They're constantly evolving. We're constantly learning more about them, and that's why you have to train as often as possible. I think the idea of bias is that it exists, and it constantly exists, and so we have to be thinking about it, because the minute that we start thinking, okay, I've learned it all, I figured it out, I know how to beat the system, I know how to figure out whether someone's telling me the truth or not telling me the truth, I know how to figure these. We don't, like, they're just, everything is imperfect. So and so I think that especially as a judge, it's very, very important that you're constantly um, questioning and learning and doing these things,
And
because yeah, because you're always faced with having to make decisions, and they're always going to be based on imperfect information.
when you mentioned that you were learning the investigative techniques, that pertains to COPA, correct?
Well, yes. So yes and no. So one of the reasons why we were doing that was not so much for me to implement these techniques, as much as, like, I wanted to understand, for instance, like how police officers were trained, because a lot of what we were doing was looking, on the backside of what they did and what choices they made and how they did these things. And so I wanted to understand certain things, like, you know, I took, for instance, Reed, which has been a controversial training. At some point, there was some cases where the Reed technique was not considered reliable. And I wanted to understand what that technique was. I wanted to understand what it was they were doing. I wanted to understand why, how it worked. And so, like, I took training on it.
What do you mean by read technique? And
It's a
how is it
Yeah,
spelled?
I think it's named after the person who developed it. I think
Got
it's
it.
READ. I'm not entirely sure, but
Mhm.
it's a specific investigative technique for how to take statements, or how to get, I think it's really more about how to get confessions, and it had been considered coercive. And so I wanted to understand it, because I wanted to understand when I might be seeing somebody using it, even if
Mhm.
I didn't, even if I didn't necessarily, even if they didn't say, hey, we're using Reed technique here, you might want to be able to say, hey, I can identify that's one of the Reed theories, or that's how they do that. And I wanted to know those things because I want to understand it. That's just an example of why we did that. Now, another one would be, I took a I took a training called FETI, Forensic Experimental Trauma Investigation. And it's a newer technique, and it's a investigative technique for uh, trying to get information from somebody who may have been in a traumatic circumstance, whether they're a witness or they're a victim, and in some cases even maybe even like someone who's just involved, defendants, whatever. And that technique was interesting because it didn't always focus on chronological order, which is what a lot of times when we do these things, even in court, we tend to do them in chronological order because it's the way that our brains in the back end sort of organize stories.
Mhm.
But it isn't necessarily the way that our brain encodes memory. And so there was a lot of conversation about how does our brain encode memory, and shouldn't we do investigations that with the idea of trying to unlock memory, rather than try to tell a story chronologically, and then what happened next, and then what happened next, and then what happened next, right? So that was a super interesting training in which we were kind of trying to learn that, trying to understand that. And I think it has just all of these things have wide applications. So while I may not be doing any interviewing or questioning or any of those types of things in my particular job, what I appreciate about it is an idea that like this is science. So you go into a DUI, for instance, and you're listening to how an officer watched and how they made their observations. And in the end, they're going to ultimately make an opinion that this person was whatever, intoxicated. In the end, you got to think like that's really a kind of a scientific opinion you've come to. And so the question is like, what was the approach? And was the approach consistent?
In other words, was it racial profiling, or was it profiling? If it's not racial, maybe something else, right?
I mean, yeah, I guess you're looking for all that. Are there things that there were done here? Or did someone go from one set of information to a conclusion and did that? And is there like a logical basis for how they got there? Or was there a consistent application of process for how they got there? So I mean, like even Fourth Amendment, like motion cases, like the law has said, like you got to have this, and then you got to have this, and then you got to have this before you can do this. And so the question becomes like, are they doing things in order or out of order? So I mean, you're always kind of like, I just think of it as we're dealing with people, and people are very hard to. It's not like a petri dish. And so all these different sort of these interview techniques, for instance, are breaking people down and breaking down memory and making it more scientific, and ultimately trying to take out some of those things like the profiling, the implicit bias. How do we remove that? As best as possible, as best as possible.
To help our listeners understand a little bit more about you, how did you get involved in COPA? Did you was it on the basis of some of your community work? If so, what was that community work? Why did they choose you?
So I had been in private practice, and at that point, again, I told you the story about the TVDL. I had really this is the first time I'd worked with clients directly, and I started to really recognize how um, oftentimes who I was dealing with was not reflected as much in what they had done, right? The mistakes they had made or whatever it was. And so um, when I went to the state's attorney's office, to be honest with you, I wanted to be a public servant. I had originally wanted to be a police officer. My aunt had been a police officer for 30 years in Madison, and I just wanted to help people. And so I recognized that it wasn't always a perfect system. COPA, in my mind, gave me an opportunity to serve the community again. The community had lost trust with police. These are the people that are, in theory, out there to keep us safe, to help us, and we've lost respect. We've lost touch with them. And so I felt like going to COPA was an opportunity to bring a lot of my experience as a state's attorney and as a lawyer with the Fourth Amendment stuff, and having done the 1983 litigation. I felt like I'd be a really good person who understood the law. And I felt like, hey, this is an opportunity for us to invent this system, be at the ground floor. Okay, right? We got this consent decree coming out. We've got this new ordinance that started COPA. We've got this new agency. We've got this really dynamic person in Sharon Fairley who's going to who's going to start this. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to be involved in something that could really be beneficial to our community, because I believe we need police. I believe we need police. I believe that that's not going to go away. So the question is, how do we give them the best training, the best techniques, the best system in order to be better for us as a community? And I found that the ordinance in COPA, for instance, which allowed COPA to publicly comment on their general orders and on investigations that they were doing, I felt like there's a real opportunity for this agency to help the community and help the department and help the officers, become what it is that we want them to be, right? And that might be idealistic, but if we don't try, we'll never get there. So I wanted to be a part of that. And I was really proud of my time there. And I was really proud of the people I worked with.
You applied for the job too, right?
Oh yeah. That's it. I applied for the job, and then based on my background, I went through they asked a lot of questions that were really consistently related to the stuff I had done. So I felt like I did well, but I just applied. Yes, just applied for the job. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, and just one final question: how did your experience in COPA help you in your job now? I think you kind of described it, but is there anything more that you could tell about your experience with COPA and how it is now that when you are when these people that are in traffic court are before you, maybe only once in their lives before a judge?
Yeah. I think it's not like individual to COPA, it's all of it. I've had experiences across the board on both sides of the aisle, right? So when I was the state's attorney, the police officers were my witnesses. At COPA, we were interviewing them and reviewing their conduct. I did defense work, so I held the hand of some of these people coming into traffic court with me. I've been in federal court. I've been in state court. So I've had the experience on all sides of what it is to be. So what I do is I just take every experience that I've had and I try to replicate good experiences I've had, whether they were judges that I thought did a really great job of being respectful and fair and kind, thoughtful, knowledgeable. And then I try to take every bad experience I've had where I've had judges that I thought did not provide and I just try to never do that. And so because I've been on all these different places, I try to take all those experiences in. So I look at, for instance, COPA, and I was like, hey, there were officers that made bad choices, but they didn't always make the bad choices because they had bad intentions.
Sorry, I think I have an interview coming up. I have to go and get my guest. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, thank you so much, Judge James Murphy-Aguilú, for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today. Good luck to you in your election.
Thank you.
Thank you.